This is the image they tried to bury. A Canadian Prime Minister standing at a podium in Ottawa, jaw set, fists clenched on the lectern, staring directly into the camera and telling the President of the United States in front of the entire world that Canada will never surrender. Not negotiate, not reconsider, never surrender. Those are wartime words. And as of this morning, Friday, February 28th, 2026, they are being matched with wartime actions. For the first time in the history of the North American alliance, two nations that share the longest undefended border on Earth, that trade nearly $2.5 billion in goods and services every single day, that have fought side by side in every major conflict since World War I, are now locked in a full-spectrum economic war with no off-ramp, no back channel, and no adult in the room. The numbers are staggering. We are talking about $700 billion in annual bilateral trade now hemorrhaging under layers of tariffs, counter-tariffs, and retaliatory surcharges. We are talking about a 100% tariff threat from the Oval Office. We are talking about a Supreme Court ruling that just blew up the legal foundation of Trump's entire trade architecture. We are talking about a Canadian government that is actively building a global coalition to bypass the United States economy entirely. And we are talking about American farmers, auto workers, and small business owners caught in the crossfire of a conflict that nobody voted for. In this special report, we are going to break down how this trade war exploded from tariff dispute to existential crisis. We are going to show you the financial mechanics that are eviscerating supply chains on both sides of the border. We are going to explain why the Supreme Court's February 20th ruling made everything worse, not better. And we are going to answer the question that nobody in Washington wants to ask out loud. What happens when your closest ally decides they don't need you anymore? Buckle up. The maps are being redrawn in real time. To understand why Mark Carney is using the language of Churchill in 2026, we have to go back to February 1st, 2025, the day Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on virtually all Canadian imports, with a 10% levy on energy products, using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The justification was fentanyl. The data showed that in fiscal year 2024, U.S. Customs seized 43 pounds of fentanyl at the Canadian border compared to 21,100 pounds at the Mexican border. That is less than 1%. But the tariffs were never about fentanyl. Sources inside the office of the U.S. Trade Representative confirmed at the time that the tariffs were a leverage mechanism designed to force Canada into a wholesale renegotiation of the USMCA trade agreement on terms favorable to American manufacturing. The problem was the blowback. Canada retaliated immediately. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced 25% counter tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, escalating within 3 weeks to $155 billion. The Royal Bank of Canada's chief economist called it the country's largest trade shock in nearly 100 years, comparing it directly to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, and that was just the opening salvo. Here is where the financial plumbing starts to rupture. The U.S.-Canada economic relationship is not a trade deal. It is a circulatory system. Canada supplies 60% of America's crude oil imports. It provides 85% of U.S. electricity imports. It is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. Canada is the #1 export destination for 36 American states. When you put a 25% tax on that circulatory system, you do not just slow the blood flow, you create clots. General Motors has publicly stated in its 2026 financial guidance that it expects $3 to $4 billion in tariff-related costs this year alone. That number gets passed directly to the consumer. The Tax Foundation estimates the average American household is paying an additional $1,500 per year in tariff-driven price increases as of 2026. On the Canadian side, the damage is structural. Economists estimate the tariff cycle has already reduced Canadian GDP by 1.5 to 2%, with Canadian households absorbing $1,700 to $2,000 in additional annual costs. But here is the catch. The tariffs were always legally fragile. Trump used IEEPA, a 1977 emergency power statute designed to let the president freeze assets and block transactions during national security crises. No president in American history had ever used it to impose tariffs. On May 28, 2025, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that the IEEPA tariffs were likely illegal. On August 29th, the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that ruling, calling the tariffs unbounded in scope, amount, and duration. And then, on February 20th, 2026, just 8 days ago, the Supreme Court delivered the kill shot. In a 6-3 decision in Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that the president had asserted extraordinary power to unilaterally impose tariffs of unlimited amount, duration, and scope, but that IEEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties. The taxing power, the court held, belongs to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. It was a constitutional earthquake, and Trump's reaction was volcanic. Sources inside the West Wing described the mood as apocalyptic in the hours following the ruling. The president held a press conference in which he called Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, both his own appointees, an embarrassment to their families. He called the 6-justice majority fools and lapdogs who were very unpatriotic and disloyal to our Constitution. Within hours, he signed a new executive order invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, imposing a temporary 10% global tariff surcharge. The next day, he tried to raise it to 15%, which is the statutory maximum under Section 122. But here is what nobody is talking about. Section 122 was designed for balance of payments crises, not trade deficits. Trump's own Department of Justice lawyers argued during the IEEPA case that Section 122 had no obvious application to the current situation because trade deficits are conceptually distinct from balance of payments deficits. They torpedoed their own fallback position in open court. Legal scholars at the Peterson Institute, Chatham House, and the Council on Foreign Relations have all said the Section 122 tariffs will face immediate legal challenges and will likely expire in 150 days without congressional renewal, a renewal that Congress has shown zero interest in granting. And this is where the Canada crisis detonates. Because while the Supreme Court was dismantling the legal basis for the IEEPA tariffs, Trump had already opened a second front against Ottawa. On January 24, 2026, after Canada signed a limited tariff agreement with China involving canola exports and a capped volume of Chinese electric vehicles, Trump posted on Truth Social that he would impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports if Canada continued its trade relationship with Beijing. 100%. He called Prime Minister Carney Governor Carney, a deliberate insult playing on his repeated demand that Canada become the 51st state. He wrote that China would eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. Sources at the Canadian Embassy in Washington reported that the diplomatic relationship, already strained to its limits, effectively went into triage mode. Carney's response was not capitulation, it was escalation. At the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 28th, the Canadian Prime Minister delivered a speech that intelligence analysts in Washington are still dissecting. Without naming Trump directly, Carney declared that the world was experiencing a rupture, not a transition. He said that middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. He warned that the strongest nations had been using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. The speech was broadcast globally. It was received in European capitals as a manifesto, and it was received in the West Wing as an act of defiance bordering on betrayal. Trump responded from Davos itself, telling reporters that Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. He then revoked Carney's invitation to his so-called Board of Peace. The personal animus between these two leaders is now a geopolitical factor, but the Davos speech was not rhetoric, it was strategy, and the strategy is now accelerating with terrifying speed. According to reports from Politico, Global News, and the Carnegie Endowment, Canada is actively spearheading the creation of a new international trade bloc. The concept is to build a bridge between the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes 12 Indo-Pacific nations, and the European Union's bilateral trade network. Carney confirmed the talks himself, saying Canada has been in direct conversations with the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand, with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and with leaders across the CPTPP membership. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is a structural bypass of the American economy. If this architecture takes shape, it would create a trading network encompassing the EU, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, and potentially India, all operating under harmonized rules that deliberately exclude the United States. The Carnegie Endowment's analysis is blunt. This coalition would represent the most significant realignment of global trade since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. It gets worse. On February 5th, 2026, Carney's government announced a complete overhaul of Canada's automotive tariff structure, creating a new import credit scheme designed to incentivize automakers to invest in Canadian manufacturing rather than American manufacturing. This is a direct attack on the crown jewel of Trump's economic agenda, the reshoring of auto jobs. On February 11th, Carney announced a new defense industrial strategy promising to increase Canadian firms' share of federal defense contracts to 70% over the next decade and boost Canadian defense exports by 50%. He is decoupling systematically, sector by sector, and the data shows it is already working. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40% in the first year of the trade war. A March 2025 poll found 62% of Canadians plan to avoid the U.S. entirely. Provinces removed American alcohol from shelves. Ontario canceled a $100 million Starlink contract. The cultural severance is reinforcing the economic one. Now let us talk about the domestic political earthquake this is creating inside the United States. On February 12, 2026, the House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to repeal Trump's Canada tariffs. Republicans broke ranks. This was among the first times the Republican-controlled House directly confronted the president over a signature policy. Speaker Mike Johnson tried everything to prevent the vote. He engineered a rules change, insisted lawmakers wait for the Supreme Court ruling, and personally lobbied holdouts on the floor. His strategy collapsed. The resolution passed. Trump reportedly threatened political consequences for every Republican who voted against him. But the vote revealed something more dangerous than a policy dispute. It revealed a fracture. Farmers in Wisconsin, auto workers in Michigan, lumber mills in Oregon, these are MAGA voters. These are the base, and they are hemorrhaging money because of tariffs that the Supreme Court just ruled were illegal. Here's the psychology that drives this conflict off the rails. According to sources close to the White House, Trump views the Canada trade war as fundamentally personal. Carney, a former central banker with a PhD in economics, represents everything Trump despises: institutional credibility, quiet competence, and the ability to build coalitions through persuasion rather than coercion. When Carney stood on the Davos stage and positioned himself as the leader of the free world's middle powers, he was not just making a policy argument, he was claiming a mantle. And Trump, whose political identity is built entirely on the projection of dominance, cannot tolerate that. This is why the threats escalate beyond rational economic interest. A 100% tariff on Canadian imports would devastate American consumers. It would raise inflation by an estimated 1.5 to 2% almost immediately. Energy prices would spike. Auto prices would spike. But for Trump, the cost of appearing weak against a Canadian prime minister who called his bluff on the world stage is worse than the cost of gasoline at $6 a gallon. Let us push the scenario to its extreme. What happens if Trump actually follows through on the 100% tariff? Here is the cascade. First, the USMCA, which Trump himself negotiated in his first term, contains a provision allowing termination if one party enters a free trade agreement with a non-market economy like China. Trump could argue that Canada's limited tariff deal with Beijing triggers this clause. If the USMCA is terminated, the 90% of Canadian exports currently exempt from tariffs lose their protection overnight. Second, without USMCA, every sector hits the wall simultaneously. Canadian crude oil, which flows through pipelines integrated into American refinery networks, becomes subject to import duties that would raise heating costs across the Northeast and Midwest. Canadian auto parts, which cross the border an average of 7 times during the assembly of a single vehicle, would face cumulative tariff costs that could add $3,000 to $5,000 to the price of every car sold in America. Third, Canada retaliates symmetrically. Electricity exports to states like New York and Michigan get surcharged or cut. American agricultural exports to Canada, worth tens of billions annually, face prohibitive counter tariffs. The feedback loop is devastating. And here is the scenario nobody in Washington wants to game out. What happens when Canada's trade diversification actually succeeds? According to Canadian government projections announced on January 26th, Ottawa plans to expand trade with non-U.S. partners and increase domestic investment by up to $1 trillion over 5 years. If the CPTPP EU bridge takes shape, if Canada's agricultural exports find permanent markets in China, India, and Southeast Asia, if European manufacturers relocate supply chains to Canadian ports to avoid American tariffs, then the leverage disappears. Trump's entire negotiating strategy is built on the assumption that Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. What happens when that assumption stops being true? The answer is that you have permanently fractured the most integrated bilateral economic relationship on Earth, and you have done it for nothing. What does this look like from Beijing, from Brussels, from Moscow? Sources at multiple foreign policy institutes describe the reaction in authoritarian capitals as barely concealed glee. The world's largest democracy is at economic war with its closest ally over trade violations that its own Supreme Court ruled were illegal. Putin sees an American president who cannot maintain alliances. Xi Jinping sees an opening to draw Canada, and by extension the CPTPP bloc, into China's economic orbit. The European Union sees a vindication of its decision to build trade independence from Washington. The projection of American power has always rested on the projection of American stability. The image of a U.S. president threatening to impose a 100% tariff on the country that supplies 60% of American oil imports is not a projection of strength. It is a billboard advertising strategic incoherence. The historical parallels are chilling. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised duties on over 20,000 imported goods, is widely credited by economic historians with deepening the Great Depression and accelerating the collapse of international trade by 65% between 1929 and 1934. The Royal Bank of Canada has already drawn the comparison explicitly, but the closer parallel may be the imperial preference system of the 1930s, when the British Commonwealth erected a tariff wall against outside nations, fragmenting global trade into competing blocs. That fragmentation was a direct contributing factor to the geopolitical instability that culminated in World War II. We are watching the same architecture being assembled today, except this time it is the United States that is being walled off, and it is doing it to itself. This is not just a trade dispute. This is the stress test of the North American order. Can the world's most integrated economic relationship survive a president who views trade policy as personal combat? Can the Canadian economy survive the transition from American dependency to global diversification without a depression? Can American consumers absorb the cost of a tariff regime that their own Supreme Court ruled illegal? And can the international rules-based trading system survive the spectacle of its founding nation tearing it apart? The founders of the post-war economic order, the architects of Bretton Woods, of the GATT, of the WTO, built these institutions on a single premise: that economic integration makes war irrational. When you tear down the economic integration, you remove the irrationality, and what remains is the oldest force in human politics, the raw calculation of power. We are in uncharted waters. The Constitution says Congress has the power to tax. The Supreme Court has affirmed it. The President has ignored it. And our closest ally has decided to build a world that works without us. Watch what happens next. Watch the legal challenges to the Section 122 tariffs. Those 150 days are a ticking clock. Without congressional renewal, they expire in late July. Watch the USMCA review. It is due this year, and sources inside the Office of the Trade Representative say the negotiations will be the most contentious in the history of North American trade. Watch the CPTPP-EU talks. If Canada successfully bridges those two trade blocs, the geopolitical landscape shifts permanently. Watch the midterms. Republican House members who broke ranks on the tariff vote are reading the same polls showing 64% of Americans disapprove of Trump's trade policies. And watch the price of oil, of steel, of the car in your driveway. Because every one of those prices has a Canadian tariff built into it right now, and the only question is whether it gets bigger or goes away. For one man sitting in the Oval Office, this was supposed to be simple. Tariffs are leverage. Canada is small. They will fold. But the former central banker in Ottawa did not fold. He went to Davos and told the world that Canada would never surrender. He went to Beijing and opened new markets. He went to Brussels and started building an alliance. And the Supreme Court of the United States looked at the president's tariff machine and said, "You do not have the authority. The walls that were supposed to protect America are now the walls that are isolating it. The trade war is not exploding. It has already exploded. The question now is whether anyone has the courage, the humility, and the strategic intelligence to put the pieces back together before the damage becomes permanent. The $600 billion relationship is bleeding out, and the tourniquet is nowhere in sight. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The history books are being written this week, and the next chapter is going to be worse. Let us get technical about what happens to the $160 billion in illegally collected IEEPA tariffs, because this is the financial time bomb sitting under the entire trade architecture. The Supreme Court's ruling struck down the tariffs, but the court did not prescribe a refund mechanism. Justice Kavanaugh, in his dissent, warned that the government may be required to refund billions of dollars to importers and called the likely refund process a mess. Senate Democrats have already introduced the Tariff Refund Act of 2026. The Trump administration has signaled it will not voluntarily issue refunds. U.S. Customs and Border Protection stopped collecting IEEPA tariffs as of February 24th, but the tens of billions already collected remain in legal limbo. Small businesses that paid these duties for over a year, some of them driven to the brink of bankruptcy, are now being told to hire lawyers and navigate a customs refund process that could take years. The Liberty Justice Center, which led the fight on behalf of small business plaintiffs, is building a centralized database to connect affected companies with attorneys. Meanwhile, every trade deal Trump negotiated under the threat of IEEPA tariffs with the UK, the EU, Japan, South Korea, China is now built on a legal foundation that no longer exists. The Financial Times reports that some trading partners are already reconsidering concessions they made under duress. The dominoes are falling and the table is shaking.